All right, thanks once again for joining us on World War II, our fourth episode from Chapter 27, as we take a look at the war effort and the human costs of war. And as we already kind of mentioned, what really got the United States out of the Great Depression was World War II. And we kind of call it the arsenal of democracy was put into full force as we had people looking for work, we had businesses looking to kind of make what was needed, and all of a sudden, instead of kicking out cars, companies would be kicking out tanks. Instead of creating commercial planes, we're creating fighter planes, munitions factories. As the men were going off to fight, women and minorities took the place of these men in these munitions factories to give all the goods that were needed to try to fight this war. And people found jobs, and they found pretty good paychecks coming in, something that they hadn't had for quite some time. But with so much needed to produce the war materials, from rubber to steel to oil, whatever it was, even food for soldiers, the United States went on a rationing scale. Basically, you could only be allotted so much food, whether it be meat or dairy or whatever, or gas each week, and you had to use your ration books in order to purchase what you were allowed to buy. And so that way no one person would get too much and divert from the war needs. That was one way to make sure we had everything that was needed. There was also a kind of propaganda machine that was established to get people in America to do certain things or give up certain things even. Overall it cost billions of dollars to fight this war, and half the money was borrowed and half the money was raised through taxes. So as people had jobs and their wages were going up, the government was able to get more money through these increased taxes. It also encouraged people to conserve, maybe build their own victory gardens where they would plant their own fruits and vegetables, so that the farmers who were actually prospering during this time and saw their profits quadruple, they could provide the food for the military, but also to try to work hard and not make mistakes, and don't say anything you shouldn't in case there's German spies in America listening. So basically, kind of everybody in America had a role to fill and something that they could do to help in the war effort. But if we turn our attention to several specific groups, the first one being African Americans, we'll see that things changed for them, but also things stayed the same. You see, World War II witnessed a mass migration of over 700,000 African Americans from the South, who had basically been working as sharecroppers, to kind of move northwards to these industrial cities of the North and West to try to help in the war effort. But as they moved north, sometimes there'd be conflict between the whites and blacks and led to some race riots throughout the U.S. But with that said, we see that over 1 million African Americans actually served in the military. Now, even though they served in segregated units and few actually saw combat, many times they were relegated to cook or cleaning or some sort of support personnel. But we do see them serve, and sometimes actually see combat, especially in the Battle of the Bulge. We also see other ones serve in the Air Force, with the Tuskegee Airmen. And so you do see different groups, kind of getting more opportunities than others at times throughout the war. However, at the same time, African Americans were fighting for victory abroad and victory at home, or double V, as they had kind of witnessed segregation, and they still weren't, being hired the same in, these booming industries as white people were. They began to push for more fair labor practices. And eventually the FEPC, or Fair Employment Practices Committee, does ban racial discrimination in war industries. And what we see is that African American employment in federal government jobs jumped from 60,000 to 200,000 in these war-related industries. So more employment opportunities allowed them to kind of voice their concerns and take a more active role in helping to win. No wonder after this war, then we see the continued push for more civil rights legislation throughout the 1950s and 60s. Another group we need to turn our attention to is the Japanese Americans, where after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States creates these internment camps. And in February of 1942, over 120,000 West Coast Japanese, including probably over two-thirds who were born here and were American citizens, were forced to live really as prisoners and kind of leave their homes and businesses. Many times having to shut their business down or sell it off, or hope that maybe a friend will keep it open for you. But regardless, these Japanese were sent to 10 different internment camps, where they were kind of guarded by military police, police dogs, barbed wire fences. They could only take with them what they could carry. And they lived out, many of them, the rest of the war in these camps. Now, to try to get by, a lot of times they pooled their resources and opened up, libraries and schools, and they even created baseball teams to help the time go by. But really, they kind of lived as prisoners. But out of these 120,000, Japanese, they were told they're doing it, for their own safety, so that Americans wouldn't, kind of retaliate against them. In reality, we're kind of fearful that some of these Japanese were spies, of which none were ever found to be spies. However, even with being put in these camps, roughly 13,000 Japanese did volunteer to fight in World War II, and one of the most highly decorated units, the 442nd, which got the nickname Go for Broke, was an all-Japanese unit that fought for the United States. Now, if these internment camps were unconstitutional, these concentration camps of the Holocaust were obviously inhumane. And what we see is that the systematic attack on the Jewish population in Germany kind of began on Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night, in November of 1938. And you can see all the little dots here on the map kind of show where these Germans maybe attacked Jewish synagogues, businesses, or went to try to take captive some of the kind of Jewish leading members of the towns. But it kind of became this beginning of the attack upon the Jewish population in Germany. Now, where Hitler had blamed the Jews for causing Germany to lose World War I, he also blamed them for the economic troubles after the war and kind of compared them to rats, and really kind of started this big propaganda machine that didn't start killing them right away, but slowly stripped them of their rights and stripped them of their personal possessions. And this propaganda kind of started showing the Germans that the Jewish population couldn't be trusted and that something had to be done. And what we eventually see is kind of what's called the final solution. These death camps, these concentration camps, in which hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of Jews would be kind of rounded up and put on these box cars or cattle cars. And whether it be the steamy hot temperatures of summer or the freezing cold of winter, they'd have to travel for days in these box cars. And many times people would die along the way and would just have kind of be stacked up in the corner. And eventually, once they got to the camps, they would disembark and they would be sent off perhaps to the gas chambers or maybe to the workhouse. Regardless, in all, over 6 million Jews are killed in the concentration camps, and another 6 million other people killed at the hands of these Nazis. And once in these camps, many times, it was known how long the body would survive these conditions, and there's nothing you could do about it. You can imagine the amount of people stuck in these places and what they had been thinking or doing to try to survive. However, the Germans didn't just use, the concentration camps, but there's also what was called ghettos. Sometimes parts of cities would be kind of walled off, and a lot of times the heat or electricity would be shut off, and people were basically left to kind of fend for themselves, and many times would starve to death. But again, just kind of another way to kind of isolate and deal with different parts of the population in these cities. But we'll also take a closer look and kind of more in-depth look at the Holocaust, and kind of discuss it in class as well. But finally, we turn our attention to world leaders, and we'll kind of take a look at what they did throughout the war to try to end World War II. Now, the big three, as well as leaders from other nations, met periodically throughout the war. But some meetings, kind of were, had more, relevant or major decisions come from them. Now, here in Yalta in February 1945, you can see that FDR's health is going downhill, and he doesn't look very healthy. But what the big three agree upon is to put on trial for war crimes many of the leading German and Japanese leaders. But they also agree, however, that Germany will be divided into 4 sectors after the war to try to kind of help rebuild. They'll work later on at Potsdam Conference in July of 45, where you can see Truman had replaced FDR, as well as Churchill had been replaced as well during the conference. And it was at Potsdam where these sides agree to take reparations from their zone from which they controlled. It's also at Potsdam where they discussed the fact that Japan needed to surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. And after issuing that warning, as we know from our previous lesson, Japan didn't surrender, and so therefore in August of 45, the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so when the war is done, the U.S.-Soviet relations, which were constantly strained by ideological differences throughout the war, continue so after it. And our once ally Joseph Stalin will kind of now be our enemy in what becomes known as the Cold War. And that is what we'll be taking a look at in our next lesson.